Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 115, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we finished the Last Man Standing story arc, where we found out that Myrddin, or Merlin, was a real person, and he was looking for a box that King Arthur stole from him long ago that contained the Holy Grail. So John gets pulled into this whole thing because his friend Rich just happens to be of the bloodline of King Arthur, so he is, I guess, officially the rightful king of England. And of course, once Rich was involved, then Myrddin or Merlin pulled John into it, and as usual, John figured everything out, but not without his friends being threatened with their lives. And we left off on the last issue with John untying Dani, his new girlfriend, and when he asked her if she was okay, she said that she was horny. So it seemed like she was not that upset by everything that happened. So first things first, with issue 115, we got the cover. We see a pretty old and wrinkled pair of a black person's hands, and they are in the shape of a heart. And because the palms are pressed together as these hands make the heart, they're kind of making a bowl, which is holding blood that is leaking out between the person's wrists. And in the blood, we can see John and Dani's faces as they stare at each other. So it seems like this is probably going to be some kind of Dani and John-centric issue. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Warren Pleece. And as we turn to the first page, we see John walking in the rain, and it looks like he's going to Dani's house. So as he walks, he lights a cigarette and begins to smoke, and his narration says, "In the aftermath of a battle, things inevitably settle back to that old predictable standard. It's somehow comfortable to be slogging through shit with metaphysical shrapnel whizzing past your ears. It gives you a sense of purpose. The really hard part comes in peacetime. That's when you have to rebuild. Of the most immediate concern these days is my unstable relationship with Dani. It's rapidly started to unravel, strand by invisible strand. She's held it together with patience and hope so far. But if I want to proceed any further, I'll need to do a spot of puncture repair. Of course, it wouldn't hurt if I worked out how to fix myself in the process. Fact is, ever since I almost got Dani killed last month, things have been a bit touch and go. Not that I blame her for being miffed, mind. It's the same reason I lost Kit after all. Since the whole Myrddin episode, we've been trying to work out where we're going, with me driving blindly in the fog and Dani giving directions. Kit just wanted me to stay away from the madness. Dani wants me to tell her the truth. She has this peculiar ability to look into my eyes and see what's lurking behind. So she's given me an ultimatum. Tell her what I'm thinking, what I'm hiding, and what I'm afraid of, or pay the uncertain price. It's the way normal couples do business, isn't it? She's given me the key. Now it's up to me to decide if I want to turn it. So in this last panel, John is actually looking at a real key because I guess Dani has actually given John a key to her house. So as John enters the front door, he says, "Put on the kettle, Helga. I'm back from the rape of England." And when he doesn't hear a response, he says, "Dani?" And then she calls down from her bedroom, "John, just go home. I'm not in the mood." But of course he doesn't do that. He just begins to walk up the stairs to her room, and his narration says, "She can get a bit funny around this time of the month, so I decide not to rise to the bait. It's all part of life's rich pattern. See, when it comes to matters of the heart or hormones, I'm willing to rise above other men and commit the occasional selfless act. After all, I can always cash in on it later." So as John gets to her bedroom door, he says, "Dani?" And as he comes into the room, he clicks on the light and he says, "What, did bloody Dracula come around?" Which I'm assuming is a crass way of asking, "Are you on your period?" But as John walks towards Dani, she turns to him and says, "Turn it off, John." And we don't see what John sees, but John looks very shocked and he says, "Jesus." And then he rushes over to her and he grabs her by the shoulders. And as he does that, we see that she has a black eye, and he grabs her by the shoulders and he very intensely asks, "Did someone... Who fucking hit you?" We see on this page that the name of the issue is In the Red Corner. Then we turn the page and we cut to someone we haven't met before. It's a clean-cut white guy in his 20s. He's got glasses and short blonde hair, and he's got a bit of a nerdy look. And in these first set of panels, we see this man walking in a library, and he's noticing a younger Dani. And over this, the narration says, "She was such a challenge, you see. Greg had recognized that the first day he'd met her, rummaging through the somber aisles of King's Library, looking rather tasty in her grossly inappropriate choice of clothing." And I'll mention here that she is not wearing anything even remotely lewd or exposing. She's wearing a long-sleeve white blouse with a black skirt. And the narration continues. He'd seen through that facade naturally. Her choice of reading material had given her away, and it was her promise of cogency that had thoroughly turned him on. Then we cut to him and Dani talking, and it looks like they're sitting in a lunchroom of some sort, and the narration continues. They chatted for a while and flirted and scrutinized, and in no time, they were boyfriend and girlfriend. Over the next few weeks, they became blissfully mired in a warm swamp of fecundity and mutual admiration. It was 2 full months before Greg's fear began to manifest. She was writing for a living, and he wasn't. And with that came a realization he was too petrified to admit. He didn't want to admire her strength anymore. He wanted to conquer it. And in the panels under that narration, we see Dani typing at a computer where we can assume she's writing, for her job. And he's just staring at her in the darkness. And as the panel zooms in on his face, we can see he looks very jealous or just full of contempt for her. Then we come back to John and Dani, who are now sitting in her kitchen at the table, and they're drinking coffee and tea and smoking cigarettes. And John is saying to her, "Who is he? I'll fucking kill the bastard." And Dani replies, "No, you won't. That'll just make it worse, and you know it. God, I tried to tell him I was seeing someone. I mean, it's been a year. He just looked at me as if I was insane, as though he didn't have to believe me if he pretended he couldn't hear me." And as John listens, he takes a drag of his cigarette, and she says, "Shit, look at you, John. You're so busy marking your territory, you haven't even touched me. It's not about you." And then John realizes she's right, so he goes over to her, and he puts an arm over her shoulder, and he puts his hand on her hand, and he says, "Sorry, darling. And I thought I was the model of stability next to this tosser." And Dani replies, It's okay, John. You are." Then we cut to a panel of her ex-boyfriend, Greg, who is sitting at a bar drinking and thinking about his time with Dani. So we get a couple flashes of what he's thinking about, and in the first one, we see him standing next to Dani as she writes furiously on a pad, and the narration says, "It was all a mistake, you see. There was this one time, right, in the middle of Bond Street, when she had one of her ideas. She made him squirm while he waited for her to finish writing it down." Then we get a panel of them arguing in a bedroom, and the narration continues. "Later, he told her how fucking unamused he was by her flaunting her manipulative prowess in public. She replied that he obviously didn't understand her creative process. Greg was humiliated, tongue-tied, incensed. He hadn't known how else to react." And I'll mention that in this panel, she is holding her wrist like he had grabbed her very hard at the bus stop or at home. So as he's yelling at her, she turns her back to him, and he puts a hand on her shoulder, and the narration continues saying, "Afterwards, she couldn't believe he'd done it. It was like something you'd see on Oprah. He was beside himself trying to make her understand. It was all a horrible mistake." Then we see him getting annoyed, I guess, because she's not listening to him in this room, so he raises his hand to hit her, and the narration continues. "It was still a mistake the next time, the last time. Dani had walked, but Greg wasn't about to let it end there. Come hell or high water, she was going to admit to her mistake." Then we cut to present day, where Greg has stood up at the bar and walked away and knocked over his glass in the process and walks out of the bar. Then we turn the page and we cut to John walking on the sidewalk. It's raining again, and he says to himself, "So much for the sensitivity training." And then his narration says, "Lucky me. It's yet another curious conundrum. I can't solve Dani's problem for her. That'd just compound my stupid mistake. On the other hand, I can't just stand idly by and let it happen again, now can I?" Then we see John walk into an adult bookstore, and he says to the man behind the counter, "I need to see Jamma." And I should mention that everybody in the store is black, and they're all kind of looking at John as he stands at the counter. And I will say, I think because of the way this is written, everybody is Jamaican. So I'm going to read it in that accent because it's written like that, but I'm sure I suck at it, so please forgive me if it's terrible. So the cashier says to John, "In dear John Mon, be careful, eh? She in a funny mood." So John walks to the back where he pointed, and he goes through a beaded curtain, and the narration says, "This likely lad of Dani's needs a swift kick up the arse, but I can't let it be known that I'm the person on the other end of the boot. Thankfully, I know a lot of people with big feet." And as John walks into this back area, we see a large black woman sitting at a table, and she's smiling evilly up at John like she knew he was coming. And on the table, of course, there's a bunch of occultic kind of things, but one of them is a skull that has its cranium removed. And so she pushes that towards John as he sits down, and she says, "Don't spill them ashes, darling boy. They're too precious to waste. Put 'em in old Harry here." And she's talking about John's cigarette ashes because he's smoking, of course. And John looks at Harry's skull and says, "Not a fucking chance, Jama. You must think I just got off the friggin' boat, love. I know your game, remember?" And Gemma kind of smiles at John and says, "I tried is what counts, and you can't blame me for thinking about it." But it seems like John has had enough of the small talk, so he gets right down to business and says, "Yeah, well, better luck next time, eh? In the meantime, I've got something that'll be right up your alley." And Gemma jokingly replies, "You'd be lost up my alley, darling boy. So what can I do for you?" And John pulls out a wad of bills and says, 200 quid. I want you to hurt someone. And as we turn the page, we get a couple panels of Gemma and kind of her backstory and her operation. So in the first panel, we see Gemma working the counter at this pornography store, and then we see her doing some voodoo. In the next panel, holding up dead bloody chickens. And over these panels, John's narration says, "Wouldn't be the first time either. Anyone with half a brain and a foot in the shadows knows if you want someone bounced, you go to Lady Gemma. She and her crew are quite the most unscrupulous bunch of scumbags this side of Brixton High Street. Still, she's always had a soft spot for me. Nasty old bag gets a perverse kick out of letting old Bill think she's running a porno scam. That way, she diverts the attention away from her real source of income. For a price, she'll pull any trick of the vicious voodoo trade. It's mostly geared towards gambling and politics, but she has been known to make the odd violent offender disappear." Then we cut back to the room where John is handing her a photo, and his narration continues saying, "Hesitantly, I hand her an old photo that I've nicked from Dani's diary, and I begin to explain. Much to my surprise, Gemma's actually interested in my dilemma. So as Gemma stares at the picture, she says, 'You got yourself a new girl, Pretty one too, darling boy. Was a shame about the last one, I thought.' Then she stands up and pins the picture to a corkboard on the wall, and we can see it's of Greg and Dani standing together holding hands, and it looks like they're on vacation or something. And Gemma continues, 'But I tell you this, I don't like the look of the fella.' And John says, 'I don't want you to kill him. Just hurt him, all right?' Then we see Gemma grab a quill, and she begins scribbling onto this photo, and she says, 'You always a surprise, John Mon. Maybe you need to stop looking at life through that little dick of yours. This boy ain't afraid of you, now is he? You don't have no right and no power to go after him, see? But he do have his own big scaries that he's deathly afraid of.' And then she turns to John and says, 'So I ask you this, when's your girlfriend cycle?' And John looks shocked at this question and he says, 'You're bloody kidding me.' And Gemma replies, 'No, but I doing you a favor. So when does she start to bleed?' And then we get a close-up of the photograph that Gemma had drawn on, and we see Dani and Greg are circled in red, and then there are multiple arrows going from Dani's breasts to Greg's chest, and also from Dani's crotch to Greg's crotch. Then we turn the page and we cut to John and Rich at a table at a pub, and Dani looks like she's kind of yelling at John or chastising him for something, and John's narration says, 'It's a delicate time of the month to be fiddling with Dani's brain, but it's no time to be treading carefully either. See, Gemma's magic will work better if I can intentionally inflate the tension, so to speak. It's a perfect excuse to act like a dirty, rotten sod for a change. Mind you, I'll have to survive unscathed to make it all worthwhile, which might prove to be difficult the way things are going.' So we see John kind of ignoring Dani as she says to him, 'So you just think you can hang out with your stupid loser fucking friends? I don't fucking care anymore, John.' And then she storms out of the pub, and as she does, Rich says, 'Blimey, Red Storm rising, eh, con job? Mind you, don't get paintballed later.' And then John takes a drag of his cigarette and says, 'Yeah, well, these things are sent to try us, mate. Best to leave well alone, eh? I mean, it couldn't be worse, could it?' But as John says this last line, We get a panel of Greg sitting in his living room, and he's grabbing his stomach, doubling over in pain. And as we turn the page, we get a shot of that picture that Jamma drew on, so we're seeing kind of what her magic is doing. So we're seeing Greg sitting on the toilet, holding his midsection like he's in pain. Then we see him in a bathtub, and then him staring at himself in the mirror, grabbing some flabby parts of his midsection. And the narration over these parts says, Greg hadn't felt very well all day. He thought he must be coming down with something nasty. But it felt weird. His stomach ached, his back hurt. He felt so tired it had actually made him cry. The nice hot bath had helped a bit, but for the life of him, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that the world was rushing by. Maybe it was mono. To his dismay, he felt fat and useless. All the rugby practice and sit-ups in the world couldn't halt the onslaught of middle-aged, he realized. Greg stood in front of the mirror, surveying the bloated, fleshy parts of his reflection, and that's when he noticed it. So as Greg is standing in front of the mirror, pinching at his fat, his towel falls down, and where his penis would have been, he sees a bunch of blood, and he begins to scream. Then we cut to Dani and John walking in a park, and it looks like maybe they're getting along a little bit better, and John's narration says, If you ask me, there was something nasty in the water on the day the Almighty created this perverse universe. It's the only way to explain why a situation has to be made worse before it can get any better. Usually, I'd not want to run the risk of pissing off Dani, especially given the current forecast for stormy weather ahead. Then we see Dani talking to John, and she's saying, About not being afraid of you. I mean, the best thing we can do for each other is communicate, John. But John doesn't say anything. He just keeps walking with her, and his narration says, Problem is, the only way to make Jamma's magic work is to twist the knife. And after a good long pause where Dani's kind of wondering what John is thinking about, John turns to her and says, Sorry, love. Can you say that again? So John is intentionally trying to piss her off, so he's pretending not to listen to her. And of course this works because she thinks he's just being a dickhead. So John just kind of leaves her and he goes to sit on a bench, and she begins to rub her head in frustration, and she says, God damn it, John, why don't you ever fucking pay attention to me? You never tell me what's going on, and you never stop playing this little lost boy character. You're always pretending to be so goddamn mysterious, and you're not. You're easy. And then she turns to look at John, and he's not even paying attention to her. He's smoking, and she says, John, are you fucking listening to me? And then she goes to sit on the bench, but he doesn't even turn to her. He just continues smoking and staring ahead, and she says, Look, it's just that sometimes you can be so downright ignorant. Right now, you're so far away from me, I could scream. I'm trying not to be upset, you know. And then she kind of gets quiet for a second and scoots away from John on the bench and says, But it hurts sometimes. And she's kind of turning away from him as she does this, and he looks like he's very sad. Like he didn't want all this to happen, but he's got to do it to make Jamma's spell work. Then we turn the page, and we get another shot of the picture of Dani and Greg that Jamma did her magic on, but now instead of there being two separate bodies, they have begun to join into one. So it almost looks like their faces are kind of glued together and their bodies in the midsection have completely conjoined. Then we get a panel of Greg sleeping, and the narration says, Greg hadn't been sleeping well at all. Then we cut to what he's seeing inside his dream, and we see Greg is sitting in a lazy boy chair, and he's tied up, and he's naked from the waist down. He does have a sleeveless undershirt on. And we see Jamma flying into his dream, and as she hovers into his view, she's got this really crazy look on her face, like she's super happy to be here. And the narration says, There was a witch in his dreams, a big, fat, sweaty black hag with a gap-toothed smile. She could see right through him. Then we see her get really close to him, and she's whispering something in his ear, and he's crying, saying, Please, I don't want to be here. And she's so close to his ear that it looks like she's going to lick him or something. And she says, Yes, you do, darling boy. You need it and all for good reasons. Then a door appears and she opens it and she smiles at him and says, Here, let's see what you're afraid of, shall we? Then we cut to what he's seeing. And as the door opens, we see Dani is standing there. And Jamma says mockingly, Ha, big surprise. And this angers Greg. So he says, I'm not afraid. I'm bloody not of her. And Jamma snaps back, So why are you shouting then? And then she takes Dani by the shoulder and she kind of guides her to stand in front of Greg. And as she does this, she is feeling Dani's arms, like she's squeezing them. And I guess they're muscular because she says, Oh, but she's a strong one, ain't she? Them muscles could whip your skinny white ass good. That's what bothers you, hmm? So, you think you have to defeat her instead of admire her, silly boy. Then Dani turns to Greg very aggressively and balls her fist like maybe she's gonna punch him, and she says, "Too strong for you, puppy dog? I can take you anytime I want." And Greg tries to argue back, screaming, "No, you can't. It's not true. You can't." But the women don't say anything. They just stare at him and point at his dick and laugh. Then Dani takes his hand and says, "Come on, motherfucker. Let's arm wrestle. I want to see what you've got." And Greg winces as she takes his hand like maybe she's squeezing it really hard. And he says, "No, I don't want to, okay?" But Dani doesn't take that no for an answer. She kneels down in front of him and forces his hand up in the arm wrestling starting pose. And as she does this, she says, "Bullshit, little pussy. You can't take the heat." And then she starts and slams his hand down. And she says, "See, that's the best you've got, Greg. And it was never good enough." Then I guess because this is a dream, all of a sudden the chair that Greg was sitting in is gone. And now he's just standing bare-assed in front of the two women. And the room is all black around them except the light coming through the doorway. And Jamma says, "You was eating her because the alternative was to admit her was cleverer than you. Now you got your big scary in front of you, darling boy. She can hit you back. Question is, do you stand up to it or run like a rabbit?" And as she says that last line, he just takes off. He doesn't even try to stand up to Dani. Then we turn the page and we see Greg wake up in a sweat and he's screaming out. And then he calms himself and sits up and puts on his glasses. And he sees it is 3:49 in the morning and he says, "Shit, Jesus bloody Christ." Then he gets up and walks over to the restroom. And as he turns on the light, we see his chest looks kind of different, but he's wearing that undershirt and maybe it's just a trick of the light. But as he comes into the restroom, he sees himself in the mirror and he has definitely grown breasts. And he screams out, "Oh my God!" Then we turn the page and we cut to the next morning. And as John gets the mail at the front door, Dani walks by him and she says, "Asshole called again last night. I didn't want to tell you." And as John walks behind her into the kitchen, he sorts through the mail and asks, "So what did he forget this time? His toothbrush or his fucking teddy bear?" And as Dani makes coffee, she says, "No, it was really weird. I mean, he sounded all high-pitched and nervous. Didn't even get to say a word, John. He totally freaked out. Told me to leave him alone and not to bother him anymore. I mean, I was just bowled over on the other end, cracking up with laughter. And then he screamed at me, and then the phone went dead." And then John lights a cigarette and smiles as he takes his first puff. And she doesn't see his smile because she's busy making coffee, or else it might have given away that he intervened in some way. And she continues saying, "But you know what was really weird? All through it, he sounded like he was scared of me." And then John sits down at the table and he begins to open one of her letters and she says, "Hey, that's a federal offense, buddy." And John kind of laughs and says, "It's addressed to me." And then Dani leans down on the table and looks John in the eyes and he says, "What? What's wrong?" And Dani replies, "Nothing. I was just trying to decide how we're doing, you and me. I mean, I guess I was worried there for a while." And then she leans over and kisses John on the cheek. And then she goes back to making toast and she says, "We're okay, so long as you don't push it." And then as she puts the bread away, she says, I think I'm about to get my period." Then we cut to John at the table and he's smoking and he's reading the letter. And his narration says, "Sometimes, given the benefit of hindsight, you realize there are some things you probably shouldn't have said, as if your brain couldn't persuade your mouth to behave itself. The last thing you want to do now, you think, is to say whatever you're thinking, not unless you want to set back the feminist movement by 100 years. But God help you, you say it anyway." Then we see John get a crafty look on his face, and to Dani saying that she thinks she's getting her period, he replies, "Tell me something I don't know." Then the bag of bread slams into his face and he drops all the mail, and he yells out, "Ow!" And the last panel of this issue is the picture of Dani and Greg has now merged them into one being, but the body is basically like Two-Face or something, where one half of her is Dani and the other side is Greg. And I'm not sure if this means that there's going to be some repercussions for Dani on this, maybe something that John didn't intend, but we'll have to wait and see. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.